our speaker, who is a relatively new member of the Shepherd Center, and unfortunately she travels a lot, so she's not often able to be here. But it's Dr. Kay Tawney, and she is retired and lives in downtown Indianapolis. And she grew up in Seattle and earned a BA from Seattle University. She has a master's in social work from the University of Texas at Austin, and an MD from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. Her current interests include supporting urban birds, native plantings, and public policy. Please help me welcome Dr. Tawney.
Okay, can you hear me? Does everyone have a copy of the page that I handed out? And it's the first page, page 83, which is the last page in the article. And I handed it out because it represents a summary of the of the problems associated with criminalizing large percentages of the population. And so it looks like I'm going to have to read it in order to get it on the TV. So I may ask some of you to help because my voice may give out. The second thing is I want to tell you that my face is not contagious, what's going on there. This is what happens when you don't pay attention to your grandmother and use sunscreen as often as you should. And they now have a step between freezing something and surgery, and it's called 5-fluorouracil. And this is what it does after a couple weeks of treatment. And then it peels off, and hopefully there's normal skin underneath. The research that I read says only 1 to 2% of precancerous skin lesions develop into cancer after this treatment. So it's worth a try, but it's really ugly. So, and this, I'm hoping that you'll pass around a sign-up sheet to, if you put your name and your email, I will send you a copy of the Foreign Policy Association presentation on this topic. And it focuses more on the consequences of the drug problem in the rest of the world for our country. And it's really quite interesting. For example, I have a friend who's very upset at the homeless in San Francisco. And what the person who does the presentation says is now they've moved from plant-based drugs to lab-based drugs. And there's a new lab-based drug called P2P. And the people who use it get quickly addicted. They're primarily young working-age men, and they live in tents under bridges, and they're homeless, and they spend their time on this drug. I don't know how they fund that drug, but they're a large part of the problem that we attribute to the homeless. Also affects immigration, so that's another thing that the Foreign Policy Association video has to share with us. So I'm happy to email it if you want it. And I am going to have to read this, so I'm sorry. I offered him a picture, but it didn't fly. So thank you.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022, a masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. There are 9 topics in this master class. We are now at the point of looking at topic number 7, which is drug policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean. We have declared war on a number of entities over time. If we look back to the early 1940s, there was a declaration of war against Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Axis powers of World War II. There was a declaration of war on illicit drugs in the 1970s, and a declaration of war against global terror. Most recently, we declared war on COVID. So what this tells us is that declarations of war are mere words. The question is what sort of policies underwrite them, give them life, and allow us to achieve our national interests. Before we can consider American foreign policy options, there are three main considerations. We're going to look at the bureaucratic landscape of dealing with international drug policy, the extent of the problem from Latin America, and then finally Latin America's own drug problem. We begin with the bureaucratic landscape. The United States, of course, is a very complicated government. The White House on top, the President presides, Drug Enforcement Agency plays a central role in our war on drugs and our policy towards illicit drugs in Latin America and the Caribbean. But it's not the only federal agency that deals with drugs, far from it. The landscape is littered with dozens of federal, regional, and state-level agencies, all of them working together or against each other in confronting illicit drug trade, trafficking, and of course, use. There are 43 federal agencies alone involved in American drug policy globally, which includes, of course, Latin America. And they're very often struggling with and against each other. They're doing so for privacy, for attention, and for resources. Or they simply struggle with each other because they speak different bureaucratic languages and have different protocols. There are several different theories of bureaucratic behavior that we can apply to American foreign policy. There is what we call RAM, or Rational Actor Model, Organizational Politics Model, or the OP model, and then BP, which is Bureaucratic Politics Model. They explain foreign policy bureaucracies in stark terms. Let's begin with the Rational Actor Model. It is by far the simplest and most straightforward. It is the ideal model for foreign policy making. It imagines the U.S. government as a unitary actor with a very clear head, which is the president, with information from all of the agencies flowing upward, being vetted and filtered, analyzed and polished, and ultimately making it to the president's desk. The assumption is that when the president and his or her team consider a foreign policy option, they have all of the best information at their disposal. Decisions flow downward in an authoritative fashion. When the president speaks, when the president decides, that is the policy that is implemented. And the country's overall interest, it is assumed in this model, prevail over all local, regional, and political interests. It's the perfect model of foreign policy, and if only foreign policy operated in this fashion. The organizational politics model has a very different system. It sees a number of organizations that are arrayed across the government, all of them involved in various foreign policy issues. For some issues, it's only a handful. For ones like drug policy, 3 or more dozen of them. They each have a head, Secretary of State, Director of Central Intelligence, the highest-ranking members of the military, whether it's in the Pentagon or the Chiefs of Staff, all of them represented at the top. But these individual organizations have their own agendas, their own bureaucratic language, and their own interests. And it's their own parochial interests that oftentimes are pursued. We would like to think that the Defense Department and the State Department work together, as much as we'd like to think that the CIA and FBI work together. But oftentimes they hide information from each other, they're competing against each other, and they view each other as bureaucratic rivals. That's the organizational politics model. And finally, and somewhat similar, is the bureaucratic politics model. Here we look only at the leadership of each of those organizations and where they sit around the table when the president enters the room. So
So clearly, the head of the table is for the president, in the president's absence, the vice president, and then everyone else is arrayed around the table, and where you sit determines where you stand. Meaning, whatever label you have, SecDef, SecState, Director of CIA, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that determines your policy position. And if you have someone that moves from one institution in the government to another, it's amazing how quickly their policy issues change, their positions change. Because where you sit around the table is where you stand on policy issues. And these elite policymakers, the heads of these large bureaucratic organizations, they trade horses with one another. They make trade-offs. They cut side deals. They're trying to create a winning coalition to gain the president's attention. It's called fighting for the president's ear. And if the president is listening to you, it's more likely that financial resources and responsibility will flow in your direction. That's the bureaucratic politics model. When we look at American agencies that deal with drug policy in Latin America, we cannot for a moment view this as the rational actor model. It is organizational and bureaucratic politics without any question. And that, of course, is not optimal. But it's not just about the United States. We're just one of many important players in the global battle against illicit drug trafficking and trade. In Latin America and the Caribbean, there are dozens of countries, each with their own bureaucratic battles. And somehow we have to overcome all of those battles, including ones with us, if we're going to coordinate policy across the entire region. What is the extent of the drug problem in the United States? The numbers don't tell us everything, but we do know that annually, $150 billion of illegal drugs enter the United States. What does that mean in terms of cost for the U.S.? We have to calculate all the medical treatments, the law enforcement efforts to crack down on drug dealers and drug consumers, the crime that is often related with addiction to drugs, and don't forget the lost productivity. When people become sick because of drugs, they can't go to work, when they die, we lose a lifetime of productivity. So the drug problem in the United States is enormous. Putting a price tag on it is virtually impossible. Here we can see the main global trafficking routes for illicit drugs. There are three sources. There is the so-called Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. That includes Myanmar, one of our great decisions this year. There is that Golden Crescent, which basically begins in Afghanistan, and then it has its travel routes from Africa and Europe, and then finally today's great decisions challenge Latin America. As we look at our hemisphere, the drugs are largely produced in South America. They find their way to Central America, into Mexico, Caribbean islands, and on to the United States. The moment we crack down on the land routes, the sea routes open up. We crack down on the sea routes, that opens the door for land routes. Very difficult to prevent the drugs from flowing into the United States. And once they reach our boundaries, they have a national network of highways and byways that they can use to spread across our great nation and poison our population. Latin America's drug problem is relatively straightforward. There are only 3 countries that promote or cultivate coca. That is, of course, the base of cocaine. They are Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. But from them, the drugs flow throughout the region and, of course, northward to the major markets in North America. In fact, 90% of the cocaine produced in South America arrives on American shores. The other 10% makes its way to Africa, to Europe, and beyond. Let's now consider American foreign policy options as it relates to drug policy. 3 main areas of focus. There's the source of the drugs, where they're cultivated, where they're grown, where they're produced. Once they have finished production, there are transit routes to take them out of region and towards the United States and large markets, and then finally the destination, which with cocaine in Latin America is overwhelmingly the United States. And it's the same for marijuana and other illicit drugs. Let's begin with the source. Well, we do have options at our disposal. We can fly planes over crops and poison them. We can spray all sorts of agents, chemicals on them that will make the leaves wilt and turn brown and ultimately die. We can do this on the ground directly with the assistance, of course, of local governments. And we can also go there and simply burn the fields to the ground. The problem is that these fields are so massive in size, and very oftentimes they're in areas that are very difficult to get to. Add to that the reality that if we're going to spray toxins over these areas, defoliants, as we used in Vietnam with Agent Orange, we're going to cause a lot of civilian damage, deformation, and death. There have been major moves to have locals replace their coca production with other profitable market items such as coffee or soy, rice, or cotton. This is something that can happen if we're willing to subsidize it. Basically do abroad what we do for our farmers here at home, give them a leg up economically so that they can make a profit by selling in a highly competitive market. We cannot ask locals in Bolivia and Peru, among others, to give up a highly profitable drug production growth for something that's less economically rewarding. That just invalidates economic rational thinking. So we have to help them along the way. But there's a major problem with subsidies. Not only do we not provide them significantly for foreign farmers, we do provide them for our own farmers. So we have poor countries in Latin America, very wealthy countries like the United States. We funnel enormous amounts of taxpayer dollars to our farmers. And when I say farmers, I don't mean mom and pop operations. I mean conglomerates with CEOs, lawyers, ad agencies in New York City, in Houston, and Los Angeles. They wear the $3,000 Italian suits. They probably wouldn't know one end of a shovel from another, but they're operating these massive farming industries. They have lobbyists that are very well paid on Wall Street and in Washington, D.C., and they're going to make sure that policies are going to be directed in the favor of their conglomerates, in the favor of their industry. So we pay farmers not to grow products. If they do grow them, we pay them not to sell them, and we pay them to store the products that they've grown, and we're also paying them not to sell, both domestically and internationally. And what this does is it creates a very high profit margin for these conglomerate agricultural industries and allows them to sell their products both domestically and abroad very cheaply. In poor countries, where there isn't that enormous tax base to tap into, there aren't these sorts of subsidies. And what that means is that their farmers cannot compete. If we ask them to compete directly with us and our subsidies, they're going to migrate north. They're coming to the United States, or if they stay at home, they're going to turn to illegal drug production. They really don't have a lot of other options. So we're clamping down on migration, we're subsidizing farmers, and we're somehow surprised that poor farmers in South America are growing coca and other illicit products. All right, if the source cannot be addressed, why don't we cut them off in the pass? Prevent those drugs from reaching the final destination. So let's take a look at how this works. There is the coca field. Inside it, you've got the production, accumulation, and then initial transit to the production labs. We've already spoken of how the original point of production is very hard to get to. How about the production labs? Those are as well armed as any labs you'll find in the world. Premium, grade A military force with the best weaponry the drug money can buy. It would be a war in those countries for the governments to go after the production labs. And of course, the way that it works is that if the military of, say, Mexico attacks a production lab for marijuana, those production labs, those criminal elements are not going to go to war with their own government and military. They're going to commit acts of terrorism and attack on innocent populations, knowing that the population will then pressure the government of Colombia, of Mexico, or one of the others to halt their war on drugs. So cutting them off there is also difficult. The weakest point in this delivery chain is with the transit of the runners. These are people that are delivering, they're sometimes called mules. They're delivering the drugs across international boundaries to hand off to a new set of runners. We can attack them pretty easily, and that's what we tend to focus upon. Low risk for us and local governments, and a very high rate of success. The problem is that these runners are 14-year-olds. They're people who are very easily replaced. They are literally a dime a dozen in most of these countries. So as long as there are young people without jobs or futures, there will always be people to replace the runner that we just arrested and incarcerated. That certainly is not going to answer the question. So why don't we go to the real problem, which is the destination point, the demand side of the economic curve. Those drugs are produced and shipped to the United States for a singular reason. We are the market for them. We demand the drugs, we consume the drugs, we pay very high prices for those drugs. We can solve this problem with focusing on the United States. And what that means is that drug policy isn't just domestic, and it's not just international, it is both of them at the same time. Our domestic policy is affected by our foreign drug policy, and our foreign policy is affected by our domestic drug policy. We call this issue interdomestic. It's international and domestic at the same time, and it's one of the reasons there are 43 federal agencies and literally hundreds and thousands of state-level agencies involved in the drug policy. If we could succeed in dealing with the destination, American demand for drugs, it would solve the transit route problem and the source problem. If there's not a profit to be made, these criminal organizations are not going to produce an illegal drug. If they do, it'll be for shipment to other places on the globe. So how do we curb demand? What do we do about America's seemingly insatiable appetite for illicit drugs? The spectrum is wide. We can go the hardline route of law and order, hiring more police, more border guards, more sea patrols, and building a lot more prisons. Or we can go to the other end of the spectrum, soft line side, and legalize at least some drugs. Take the criminal element out of it, as proponents argue. Law and order, we've been trying that since the 1980s at a minimum. It was in the 1980s, Mr. Reagan said, we're going to go after drugs. Mrs. Reagan said, just say no. But the government decided to begin incarceration with mandatory sentencing for drug offenders. And just look at the population explosion among American prisoners. So we have the Nixon Declaration, we have the Reagan Sentencing Reform Act. Put those two together, and we don't have enough prisons to hold them all. There are very few countries in the world that incarcerate a higher percentage of their citizens than the United States. We can continue this curve right out into 2022, and the numbers are up and away. Now the major trend is private prisons. So we have, again, corporations, profit motive, high-paid lobbyists in Washington, directing resources to build private prisons, who have an incentive to encourage the sort of domestic policies and laws and sentencing that will send more customers to them, and of course by customer I mean prisoners. So if law and order isn't working, how about legalization? There's a strong movement in this country, and many U.S. states now have legalized pot or marijuana, but this never works because you can't legalize cocaine. You can't legalize methamphetamine. You can't legalize so many of the the very hard drugs, the dangerous killing drugs that are very popular in the United States. And even legalizing marijuana won't work. I mean, companies will make a profit and people will smoke, I guess you call it safe weed, but there's always going to be a demand for stronger marijuana, stronger beyond the envelope of what domestic law allows, and there will always be a demand for cheaper marijuana. Legalizing it raises the price. It must be regulated, inspected, taxed, and as a result of that, the price of marijuana goes up, and that means there's always a market for less expensive, i.e. illegal marijuana being shipped in, including marijuana that is much, much stronger than what people can get through the legal sources. Legalization doesn't work, law and order doesn't seem to work, but there's a whole array of options in between, both domestic and international. From a foreign policy point of view, if the United States is going to succeed, short of ending American demand for drugs, which no one sees happening in the future, we have to get along better with the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean. We need to build trust with Mexico first, because when there is something that happens across that border, and we want to send the FBI or other special agents over to investigate, we need the Mexicans to cooperate with us and to allow us access to those areas. And if we don't have good relations with them, and if we can't trust them, then we can't work with them. Mexico is the first point of focus, but it very quickly becomes all of Central America, the Caribbean, and South America. That is a very tall order, and one historically that we have not been terribly successful at. We have a poisoned relationship with Cuba, and many countries in Latin America refuse to work with us on important issues until we can get beyond the Cuban issue. Beyond that, there is the very chilly relationship we historically had with Brazil, the largest and most influential country in the region. So rather than making a policy that includes all of Latin America and the Caribbean, we should focus on Mexico first, clean up our mess of a policy in Cuba, which serves no one's interest economically or politically, and then work very hard on a better relationship with Brazil. From there we can branch out and perhaps have more success in heading off the illegal drugs that are entering this country. Solving the destination is first, but focusing on foreign policy and better relations certainly has to be part of the calculation. Thank you once again for attending this lecture as we move quickly towards the end of the 2020 series. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Okay, so what I've done. Thank you. And is that sign-up sheet going around?
It's on your sheet, exactly.
Oh, it's all, you're all done signing up? Have you people had this opportunity to sign up? Okay, I'll get you later. So what I've done during this time is kind of cut down on the amount of reading. And I think we all know from the papers the amount of violence that goes on in Mexico because of drugs. And what happens is the amounts of money involved are so large that the drug traffickers function as oligarchs able to influence the political system and to influence the policies in the country. So that this has resulted in a lot of violence and threat to the democracies of that area. I thought initially in my ignorance that we could solve the problem by sending our military in to knock some heads and clean up the place. And then I realized that you can't invade a foreign country. And what it looks like from my reading is that we're fighting a shadow war. We're funding the military, the state militaries of a lot of these countries so that they become strong enough and well armed enough to take on the violent drug cartel people. I want to comment too, the gentleman here said that no one, or that it was impossible to legalize all drugs. And I think it was 3 or 4 months ago, Oregon legalized all drugs. And I have no idea how that's going. I get a paper from that area, but I haven't been able to find any articles on that to see what's happening. So let me just say that I want to discuss the few options there are in policy, and I'm just going to quickly read the thoughts on why the economic costs of mass incarceration or the current approach to our handling of the drug problem has social and democratic costs. And the article points out that it's wrong to underestimate the harm caused by drugs, but would be equally misleading to ignore the difficulties that prohibition has entailed. The long record suggests that the punitive approach doesn't work, but it appears to work better than some of the other approaches that have been tried. But the cost is high. For example, in September of 2012, at the United Nations General Assembly, the presidents of Colombia, Guatemala, and Mexico called on the UN to lead a far-reaching debate on the scope and limits of drug policy, identifying illicit drug trafficking and related illicit markets as major drivers of violence and violent death in Latin America. They called for a long overdue international debate. And you can see on the latter part of this handout where it says, it's like the second new paragraph in the handout, that Colombia, Guatemala, and Mexico came also in 2016 in hopes of reforming drug policy and the international drug control regime. And many African countries apparently at that time finally admitted that they were having similar problems because of the drug control issues. Latin America and European countries converged around the themes of drug policy and human rights, yet their views didn't result in any kind of consensus. Latin American representatives called attention to the implications of prohibition and punitive enforcement for violent dynamics and human rights in their countries. And as a result, there's no common agreement in the world as to how this should take place. So this page points out the costs. And the costs they include the diversion of resources and budgets from prevention, education, and treatment to law enforcement. The enlistment through significant budgetary allocation of local and state police corps in anti-drug operations, DEA training of police forces and their diversion from more pressing crimes, the adoption of ever more punitive legislation involving both the creation of new civil penalties and the expansion of criminal punishment, from mandatory sentences to greater use of the death penalty, erosion of constitutionally protected civil liberties, increasing reliance on irregular practices such as the admission of illegally obtained evidence in drug trials, the dismantling of legal restrictions on policing, the militarization of police forces, and greater dependence on the armed forces, massive arrests and mass incarceration, propelling in turn the expansion of prison systems and police forces. And this has clearly been the result of our policy in this country. Despite the fact that the majority of the arrests were for possession, and of these, the majority were for possession of marijuana. And that appears, as I said when I did the demographics talk, 100,000 people died from drug overdoses in 2021, I believe. And that's quite an increase, and it appears to be partly due to the result of switching to lab-based drugs. Charlie just explained to me the reason that that's so bad is that they make the doses of the drugs high enough for the addicts to get high because they don't want to damage their market, and yet in the process they're killing people who take drugs and don't have the physical tolerance to the drug built up. And that's a huge problem. Anyway, Charlie's got the microphone poised. I'm going to read the question. And these are the discussion questions in the book. It says, should the punitive enforcement of drug prohibition continue to be used, or is it time to change tactics? Why or why not? And I'd like to hear what you think we should do. Does anyone? Yes?
I got a question.
Just a second here. I will bring the microphone around to people as you raise your hand. I'll try to get you in order. And we have brand new batteries this week. They went dead last week, so. Okay, I think we have one question. Do you want to read all of the questions first? Or?
Sure, I can do that. And this is the second question. From its inception in 1909, the international drug control regime has been dominated by the United States. Why has the United States sought to enforce its desire for punitive enforcement in the regime? Has this been beneficial? This is the third question. Members of the poorer segments of Latin American society have come to rely on the drug trade as a means to financially support themselves, having been denied work in official sectors. Does this reliance justify the presence of the drug trade? Why or why not? To what extent have human rights been sacrificed during the war on drugs? Okay.
Okay, we have one. We have our first question from Robert here.
I got a question. You talk about why people get and take the medicine and get high, but you say that, and because people are. I think people is scared, and now. And I read in the other thing, people is scared. They're scared of what this world is going to do, and we gotta realize that. And we gotta realize that now it's getting worse and worse and worse. And can you tell me what's going to happen when it gets worse and worse?
Well, I was off on my prediction on COVID, so I'm not giving any more predictions. I'll just say that as I read through articles in the paper, I see them titled about the number of suicides in youth, the anxiety and lack of respect being found in schools. I have friends who are teachers that can hardly wait to retire because the kids are out of control. And, there used to be a saying, better living through chemistry. And I think that you're right. I think a lot of people are scared. If I were a kid growing up and thinking that we were facing a famine because of climate change, regardless of the cause, I would be really upset. I would think I might have no future. And kids are vulnerable to experimentation anyway. And they don't realize that you aren't really invincible and immortal.
I think you were next, Suzanne.
Yeah. This whole video, it just sort of kind of reminded me of the things people say about gun control. We can't do this because that will happen. We can't do this. It's all, we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't do this. And it seems to me that we're completely lacking in imagination. And, you know, just saying, it sort of left me feeling like, oh, there's nothing we can do except what we've always done. And I also feel like they're completely overlooking the regulation of alcohol. You know, we don't have a big problem of lead alcohol in this country, I don't think. So I think it is possible to regulate drugs. And we do it with alcohol. How come we can't do it with drugs?
I throw that open to you guys. What do you think? I think there's a question in the front row.
To answer your question, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in Oregon. That may give us a clue. My question is about the 43 federal agencies involved in one thing or another regarding drugs. Some administrations have had drug czar. In your research and readings, have you found whether or not that was effective to try to coordinate all these different agencies and what they're doing?
I didn't find anything, but one country, somewhere along the way, I remember someone commenting that that seemed to be a more effective way to handle the coordination between agencies, to have a drug czar, and that might have been in the Foreign Policy Association video, which really focused more on the United States and our issues and the impact on our country. So it's certainly worth something to consider and explore more. I'll Google drug czar and let you know what I find. Yes.
What's the reason that the cost of the drug is cheaper in Canada? Because some people buy the drug through the mail from Canada. Why we don't have such a problem? The drug is so expensive.
Well, my understanding of that is that, and I'm going to put this in the category of opinion because I don't have anything other than a compilation of what I've read, but the American drug companies believe that the money is here to charge more. And as you know, to get, there was a recent issue around the cost of insulin. That was in Congress. I think there was an executive order on the price of insulin, but I could be wrong on the details. And recently in Congress, there weren't the votes to allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices. And so I think that that's part of it. Does anyone else have any information on that?
The lobbyists.
Right, they have powerful lobbyists. But, and again, you're looking at the money here. The money talks, and you know that's one of the problems with trying to get other approaches is that there's a lot of money flowing from yours and my pockets on up into the policy centers of the United States. So I don't know what to do about that. I'm open to suggestion. What do you think we should do? Keep on with our punitive approach at the border, where they're now sending drugs up off the coast in submarines, specially built submarines, to haul drugs, not people?
We have some answers for that. This thing doesn't seem that's working. Okay, who's next? We've got plenty to talk about today, that's for sure. So, Howard?
Not a question, but an opinion. I think
that the drug user, those people who are potentially DOA on drugs, should be allowed to do the right thing and be a DOA. That is my comment. And that would cut down on the drug use. Another comment. I doubt if we have any drug dealers coming across our southern border. But we might have some drug users. Do you have an answer?
No, I don't have an answer. I'm really sorry. I wish I did have the answer. I just want you to know that true drug addiction has a physical component, and that's the reason for trying to make Narcan more widely available to people who have family members that use drugs, is because that will at least stop the deaths. 100,000 people dying from drug overdoses seems to me that that's a lot of people for something that's preventable or largely preventable. I don't know, it depends. I mean, everybody's struggling for solutions, and it depends on where you put life versus money and that kind of thing. I don't have an answer for you. I can understand that the logic might be appealing, but there are other solutions, and like I said, there's a whole physiologic and emotional thing. I think people would have trouble letting their kids die from an overdose if it were preventable. People, you know, your loved ones, you love them, and you don't like that to happen to them. So.
This is kind of a broad question. From what I've read, there are from what I've read, there are countries in the world that are highly evolved and wealthy who treat crime and rehabilitate. There are people that are charged with crime to work on getting them out of prison and the incarceration system. And they have a small percentage that go back to prison because of that. Also, there are countries in the world that treat drugs completely different than us. They legalize them, and when they have a problem, they help rehabilitate them. What is it, my question is, what is it, are factors in the American culture over the last 400 years since 1619 that contribute to the massive difference in the United States and how they treat these issues compared to some other highly civilized countries in the world?
I'm going to throw that open.
Yes, that's quite a question.
It is quite a question.
This doesn't, I'm going to have to look into it. This doesn't seem to be working as well with these new batteries. Okay, you have an answer for Steve's question?
Have there been psychological studies of what works around the world, like comparison of the United States versus other cultures? And I have known, my husband used to be a doctor, and I have known when he had to deal with people on drugs. And it was very difficult for him and also for the other person, particularly if they came from a family where there was no love in childhood. Can you answer that? Have there been studies as to what works?
I think that there's probably a large literature on what works for an individual. This page makes the statement that the authoritarian approach will suppress drug use, but it does so at a cost. It diverts resources. We have 5% of our population, 5% of the world's population, and yet we have over 25% of incarcerated people in the world. I don't know, I mean, I have some ideas, but I'm not going to share them. about what makes us punitive. I belong to a group, and we've been studying the history of the corporation and of the Constitution, and this is ingrained in our culture. And, you know, I don't think that we know what on a scale, a mass scale, would provide for the human values as well as the suppressing of drug use or trying to dry up the source. I don't know of any studies. I've heard that in Amsterdam, and this is in the Foreign Policy Association presentation, Amsterdam drug use has increased when they made it legal, but I don't know that their problems have increased. So Holland would be a place to look. Again, you know, I would Google how does Holland handle its drug problems and try to, you know, get some way into the answer of your question by looking at that. And I guess the thing that I want to throw out is that we're looking at criminalizing a lot of other activity, and that's going to divert resources in the same way that are listed here. It's not going to solve the problem. It's going to, from a human standpoint, but it does from an authoritarian, totalitarian point of view. But you have consequences, like they're talking about making medical people liable for errors. Well, traditionally that's been handled through the malpractice system, but they're talking about criminalizing those errors. So do you think that your brightest people are going to want to go into medicine if they're going to have a prison sentence for making an honest mistake? If you look at, like, neurosurgeons, 1 in 3 neurosurgeons, this is an old statistic, so I don't know what it is now, but 1 in 3 got sued every year. Well, that's bad enough because your malpractice premiums and your time in court is huge. You can't make an honest mistake if you're going to go to prison, and the same kinds of things that it talks about here are going to be used to handle your situation. So I think we really have to think carefully about how we want to criminalize things and consider, you know, looking at other approaches.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time. I might ask, does everyone who wants the hour-and-a-half Foreign Policy Association video, wants that information from Kay, if you sign this? Yes, I'll give these to you.
Thank you.
Okay, I really, really appreciate your presentation.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to do it. I just hope it was helpful and certainly thought-provoking. Thank you very much.